about this whole, it had already emerged a long time ago, but sort of comes back to the fore, which is this argument of just war. Just war is really a concept to say, we can wage war, but there are certain limitations that we have to place on ourselves. And here there are two main concepts that I think are important to frame this discussion. The first is jus ad bellum, which is the law towards war, and which refers really to how you enter a war, meaning what are the reasons for entering a war. And jus in bello, which is how do you really conduct that war, meaning once you're into that war and you're into the occupation, how do you really conduct the implementation of that war? These are important concepts because ultimately they frame the way occupation is going to take place. Okay? So moving on, we see an emergence of, in 1949, of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which outlines, and this is very important, the rights, the protections, and outside assistance to be afforded to those under occupation. So basically, it emphasizes the sovereignty of the invaded state, meaning even if an army were to invade a country or a territory, that territory would remain sovereign, even if its sovereignty is put on hold, quote unquote, temporarily, meaning the state will not lose that sovereignty, which is a very important point. Okay? So the minute the army pulls out, automatically that state regains full operational sovereignty. And then the rights of the people occupied is inalienable, meaning that even if there's an occupying force in that country, the rights of the people who are occupied are inalienable by international standards. Now, the third part of my presentation today has to do with some of the key issues that people are grappling with when they discuss occupation. And here are a few. First, occupation is perceived in the military jargon as a legitimate way of implementing war. So you start with that. And here I quote the Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz, who says, "War is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. If you are to force the enemy by making war on him to your bidding, you must either make him literally defenseless or at least put him in a position that makes this danger probable. It follows then that to overcome the enemy or disarm him must always be the aim of war. This is a legitimate way of pursuing your goal when you enter a country, because you have to win a war, and in order to win a war, you have to force the enemy to let down their arms, and that often leads to occupation." Okay? So that's one sort of discussion, meaning whether it's an acceptable part of war or not. Another part of that is an occupier. The definition of occupation still is seen by many as occupying a foreign territory without permission and against the will of the occupier. This has been the tradition definition, meaning we don't accept really the idea that you can occupy something. However, in more recent days, and in part because of recent developments such as the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia, East Timor, the war on terrorism, etc., we have seen an attempt at re-justifying the process of occupying foreign lands. And that has included things like an invitation to occupy by certain population for the protection of the regime, for protection of the people, or for a regime change. So that's one area that has been reopened. The second is the application of terms of peace treaties, meaning the UN reaches an agreement somewhere, and in implementing these peace treaties, the UN forces are allowed in. And you can think of a number of places where this is happening around the world. And last, the invader self-defense move, meaning the invader has to protect its territory, and as such does a preemptive strike by invading another country and occupying it. Now, these new attempts at imposing legal limits on the behavior and role of the occupier through international law and through other means are really about increasing transparency and accountability on the occupier. Meaning, if we can't stop armies from marching in, let's at least limit the way they can operate once they're inside those countries. And here, there is a number of texts, which I will not go over, that basically frame this discussion. Some having to do with new standards being adopted by nation states. Some having to do with the International Committee of the Red Cross. And here, the International Committee of the Red Cross has really pushed a number of standards through in order to say, look, yes, you're in, but there are inalienable rights. Yes, you're in, but there are certain things that you have to follow. Yes, you're in, but the citizens' rights don't stop. Meaning it's not that while you're invading, we put on hold people's rights, and then once you're done occupying, they are reactivated. No. As long as they're not engaged in fighting, their rights have to be respected. And that body of literature is increasing with time. And we hope that, obviously, that things would move beyond that as well. So, demands guarantees for those under occupation that do not take direct part in hostilities. And in addition, the ICG has also taken some position in Congo, for example, or including in Palestine, where it considers occupation as triggering jurisdiction under human rights law, which brings in a whole body of laws having to do with human rights. And this point by the ICG, which is very important, tries to really embed the rights of people, even under occupation. Now in terms of ending occupation, here there is a whole discussion as to whether occupation ends when the troops leave partially, whether the troops still have planes in the air, whether the troops have some people working for them even though they're no longer there. This whole debate is also a key debate in the discussion of occupation and how we deal with occupation. Okay, now this is the last part of my presentation for this morning. And it focuses really on how occupation has been dealt with historically. I identified 4 areas where I think the bulk of the effort has focused. One is military response through regular army, meaning you try to occupy and there's a regular army that tries to push you back. The second is armed resistance movements. And here we see the French, for example, resistance against the Nazi, Palestinians against Israelis, Algerians against France, Vietnamese against the US, Lebanese against Israel. All these are examples of armed resistance. We then move to non-violent resistance movement. And here, I will be spending more time on this part, because the part that really interests me, I'll tell you why in a minute. But examples of non-violent resistance include things like Indians against colonial Britain, Danish people against the Nazi regime, Polish against USSR, Lebanese against Syria in 2005, etc. There are a number of examples that we can include here. Integration, and then the last is integration through capitulation. The integration through capitulation situation is one where the invaded, or the occupied, accepts the presence of the occupier, pays the taxes, but can deal in 2 ways with that occupation. Either by integrating into the occupier's sort of standards, norms, etc., or by trying to convert the occupier to their own set of values and set of standards. Meaning, if an occupier were to invade, let's say, a certain region, we would try to work on the occupier